Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare. I'm Kurma, and I'm speaking to you from Portugal. Panchakalpatarubhyascha kripasindhubheva patitanam pavanebhyo vaishnavebhyo namo namaha. I guess you could say I'm the unofficial historian of the Melbourne Temple. I hope your festival is going well. I've been asked by Srimati Achincha Rupa Devi Dasi to give you some Melbourne Temple history. And this history, of course, is based on the Great Transcendental Adventure. If you haven't seen the original copy of the Great Transcendental Adventure, which you may have, then you may have seen this, the Great Transcendental Adventure reprint. And that's available here in the bookshop. The history of the Melbourne Temple commenced actually many hundreds of years ago with the decree by Mahaprabhu that Prithivite yata nagaradigram sarvatra pacha hoibe mo nam. Lord Chaitanya predicted that the chanting of the holy names would resound in every town and village of the planet. And our dear spiritual master, Śrīmad Bhaktivedanta Swami, Srila Prabhupada, was instrumental in putting this into place by establishing the glorious International Society for Krishna Consciousness. In 1970, he sent two of his disciples, Balimardana and Upendra, to Australia. The Krishna Consciousness movement in 1969 and 1970 was a huge explosion of success. And that also applies here in Australia, because Balimardan and Upendra, who didn't know each other before they came here, established the first Krishna Consciousness Centre in Sydney in 1970. At that time, after they were settled, they started to think that they would like to expand their horizons. And the second biggest city in Australia, Melbourne, was in their sights. And so in 1970, I met the devotees and on the streets of Sydney. In fact, my father met Upendra and he introduced me to Krishna consciousness. So I owe a great debt to Sriman Upendra. And it was Upendra that first came here to Melbourne in 1970. They wrote to Srila Prabhupada and asked for his blessings. That was the communications at the time. And of course, those blessings were given enthusiastically. Prabhupada was very eager to encourage whatever little spark of self-surrender he found in others. And so he said, he said, yes, of course you can do that. And so they did. And Upendra went to Melbourne with Upananda Das Brahmachari and a resident of the Southern Lands, Shriman Krishna Prema Prabhu, who was known as Bhakta Frank. So the Krishna consciousness movement took its roots in South Yarra, near the Melbourne Botanical Gardens. That was the first little centre. They were paying $10 a week rent. It was something which they could not turn down. And every day they would preach Krishna consciousness in the streets of Sydney. In fact, it was Bhakta Frank that recalled his first Harinam, the first Harinam in Melbourne. He said, I had travelled from the Sydney temple to help Upendra and Upananda in Melbourne. One crisp, late winter morning, it was a Monday, we caught a tram from Domain Road to downtown Melbourne, and we walked from Burke Street to the town hall in our dhotis, shiny, shaven heads, carrying a box of Back to Godhead magazines, mridanga, and kartals. People had never seen the devotees before in Melbourne. And the crowds sort of parted before us. Outside the town hall, Upendra said, we should wait until the clock struck 12. This was the auspicious Abhijit moment, in fact, and an auspicious time to start the Sankirtan movement in Melbourne. At the last dong of the clock, Upendra started playing kartals. Actually, Upendra was playing Mridanga and Frank was playing kartals, and heads turned. People literally stopped dead in their tracks. Within a few minutes, there were many hundreds of people crowded around us, spilling onto the road and blocking traffic. We practically stopped the whole of Swanston Street, Frank said. The police had to hold the crowds back to allow the cars to pass. Then Upendra stood up on the steps of the Melbourne Town Hall and gave a short but spirited talk while I, Dr. Frank, furiously handed out Back to Godhead magazines and collected donations. And he said the Hare Krishna movement had started officially at that time. So on Sundays, the devotees would go out chanting, and they would have a little Sunday feast. And they found that the South Yarra place was insufficient for their use, so they started looking for a bigger place. South Yarra was a temporary residence, and soon they moved to a single-story terrace house in Carlton. By the way, at this stage, you may be wondering about this picture behind me. Yes, it is the Melbourne Temple, and yes, these are the original residents of the Krishna consciousness movement in Melbourne, and there I am, right up the back. And there's a whole lot of beautiful faces here. Some of these devotees have since passed on. This was a very classic shot, and you know where this was taken, of course, in the front garden, around 75. So yes, the Hare Krishna temple moved, and it moved to Station Street in Carlton. This was the first real temple of the International Society for Krishna Consciousness in Melbourne. A number of devotees joined at this time: Mekhala, Shamananda, Sanaka, Chekitana, and some others. Dwaipayana and Jayadharma, they actually joined the Melbourne Temple while they were in South Yarra. These are the classical members of the Krishna consciousness movement in the southern regions of Australia. So by now, it was the end of 1971. We find that the Melbourne Temple has moved to St Kilda, a holy place of pilgrimage, 14 Burnett Street in St Kilda. 14 Burnett Street, of course, is a classical tirtha. It was at 14 Burnett Street where the Hare Krishna movement was based for 3 years, that Sri Sri Radha and Krishna, our very same Sri Sri Radha Krishna from the altar, they were installed in St Kilda in 1972. And Radha Vallabha were installed in 1973, and Jagannath appeared actually also in 1972. So Prabhupada first arrived in Australia on the invitation of his disciples in Melbourne on the 5th of April 1972, and he came to us while we were in St Kilda. He offered initiations, and a host of men and women received their first and second initiations on the 6th of April 1972. This was the date of the installation of Radha and Krishna. I received my second initiation that day, along with Jagatarini Devi Dasi, and there were many first initiations and some marriages at that time. In the same year, Deepak Prabhu, my first temple president and head pujari of Melbourne, and Dwaipayana Prabhu, who had joined in South Yarra, and the wife of Deepak, whose name was Nartaki, who's now residing in Bombay. You may have met Nartaki. They carved the beautiful Lord Jagannath from a lump of wood, as in the classical style. And these beautiful deities that you see on the altar were carved at the Hare Krishna shop in Little Lonsdale Street. And then they were placed on the Rath in 1972 for the first Melbourne Ratha Yatra, and that was their formal appearance to everyone, an initiation. So Srila Prabhupada then visited Australia another time. He visited Melbourne on the 8th of February 1973. at that historical occasion, Sri Sri Radha Vallabha were installed on the altar. So now we have Radha and Krishna, small Radha and Krishna. We have Radha Vallabha, and we have Jagannath, Baladev, and Subhadra. Now, at this time, the Melbourne Temple was getting rather cramped. There were 10 rooms, but they were not huge rooms, and the Krishna consciousness movement was attracting many boys and girls. Madhavisa, who was the GBC and the beloved Madhavisa Swami, who inspired us all, he started looking for a new temple which was suitable to serve as Australia's headquarters. He wasn't thinking small. He wanted a wonderful temple. Prabhupada had given full approval 6 months before to find a temple, but we had not found one. So it's now 1974. Madhavisa has located a small property. Actually, no, he's located a huge property, should I say, an enormous collection of church and convent buildings covering many acres on the Beach Road, Beaconsfield Parade, which is parallel to Danks Street. He informed Srila Prabhupada of his find, and Srila Prabhupada expressed interest. Later, Madhavisa wrote a letter to Prabhupada, and he said, we found a huge property. I'm going to send you photos. It's a large church and convent. The real estate men report that it will go for at least $1 million, and $1 million in 1975 was, 1974 was a huge amount. He requested that perhaps the BBT could make us a loan, and Prabhupada was not at all negative about the proposal. He was very enthusiastic. So we were going for the white elephant. In other words, it was a huge property, a huge 10 acres of buildings. And Prabhupada was very interested in the proposal. Madhavisa wrote to Prabhupada, as I said, and he said, when you come for your third visit to Melbourne in 1974, we can talk about it further, which they did. So in 1974, Prabhupada danced and enthusiastically chanted throughout Melbourne on the famous Melbourne Rathayatra. This was the third Melbourne Rathayatra. And again, Prabhupada mentioned that the Melbourne Temple was very congested. So one morning, Srila Prabhupada took a morning walk on Beaconsfield Parade with Madhavisa and some other devotees. It was very windy. Prabhupada was wrapped in his chadar, and he walked along. The temple was not in Albert Park. The temple was in St Kilda. So they were walking the other way from St Kilda down the beach road. And when they got to the spot in Albert Park, where the huge Catholic church complex was situated, Prabhupada was shown this building. Prabhupada was explained by Madhavisa that this was a convent for girls. From the street, he directed Prabhupada's attention to the other features of the property: a huge chapel, commercial side laundry rooms, a theatre, eating quarters. This is almost 10 acres of prime beachside real estate, Srila Prabhupada, he said. Prabhupada was interested. How much are they asking? Well, over $1 million, Srila Prabhupada. Prabhupada said nothing, but he appeared unfazed by that price. And later he said he would like to see inside the property. So a few days later, Madhavisa arranged for a tour of the beachside property. After breakfast, the devotees accompanied Srila Prabhupada on a morning walk, and they visited the convent. They were shown around by a real estate agent and some elderly nuns. The devotees noticed how Prabhupada was so respectful. He held his palms together before the stained glass windows of the chapel. He asked the nuns, is this Jesus? Is this Mary? And when Prabhupada reached the altar area, he bowed his head reverentially. On returning to the car after the short tour, Prabhupada made his intentions clear. Yes, he said, we should give that we should buy that place, offer them $1 million. So what happened next? This was a few days before the Rath Yatra, and then after the Rath Yatra, Prabhupada wrote to Madhavisa. Now, about that convent, he said, which you showed me, I think that place is very suitable for us, and if possible, we must purchase it. So the reasonable price should be on the land value. So far, the buildings are concerned, they have already dismantled part of it, as they were noting when they visited, and it will be our expenditure to rebuild. Considering these points and talk with the realty man at what price they can sell the property to us. I'm going to Los Angeles, and along with me there is Bali Madan. If this matter is successful, you can call me in LA. I will be there for a week. How much financial help you require, you can talk to me and I will do the needful. I hope this meets you in good health. Prabhupada was expert in all things, including real estate. So, however, things took a turn after that. And a few weeks after Prabhupada had seen the place, because everyone visited the convent in their dhotis and saris, and it was a little confronting for the Catholic authorities. In fact, the church authorities gave Madhavisa a decisive caveat to the sale. Sale would be conditional that the chapel be demolished. For whatever their reasons, they were afraid. And that was the condition. Regarding the convent, Prabhupada wrote, they have put an awkward condition that the chapel must be demolished. Excuse me. Indirectly, they have denied to sell it to us. Never mind, he said, find another property. Prabhupada wrote a PS because he had met some very high-level church authorities in Melbourne for his 1974 visit, the Bishop of Melbourne, the Reverend Gordon Powell from the Scottish Church, and Bishop Kelly, and he asked that they perhaps help us in our negotiations with the Catholic Church. However, he noted the proposal is malicious, but they can rectify it. But the owners, the Catholic Church, were adamant, and the convent property was abandoned. So, unfortunately, we didn't get that property. But not long after this, a much smaller but more suitable property was found only 1 block away in nearby Danks Street, Albert Park. It consisted of 2 buildings, Our Lady of Mount Carmel Boys School and an adjoining Victorian mansion. The whole property covered an area of 23,500 square feet. Madhavisa sent photos and plans of the property to Prabhupada, who commented that it appears that the house is very nice and sufficient for the present. That was 50 years ago, and now, of course, it is too small, but we couldn't imagine how that would be possible. But, of course, the Krishna consciousness movement has grown. Still, Prabhupada said, it appears that the house is very nice and sufficient for the present. The convent was a better place. Either way, any of the houses you can secure. Of course, the first house was already at this stage not one of the choices. Madhavisa enthusiastically pursued all opportunities to purchase that property on Danks Street as the new ISKCON Australian headquarters. But there were problems again. The Catholic Church were expressing the same reservations at selling us the property. So at that stage, we went incognito, and all negotiations were then conducted in plain clothes. And the owners were then not aware that the devotees were wanting to purchase. And this was at the stage when the property, 197 Danks Street, was in fact sold to a property developer for many thousands of dollars less than ISKCON's bidding price. So there was definitely some maliciousness involved. We would never sell this property to the Hare Krishnas, was the mood of the Catholic Church at the time. But the story, of course, as you probably realize, didn't end there. Even though the 197 Dank Street was officially sold to a property developer, the property developer found that he was in financial difficulties. He had not reckoned that the older of the properties, 2 buildings, the beautiful property that you see behind us here, this is the original building, and it was owned by the National Trust, and Australia's Historical Building Register recorded that this building could not be demolished, and the local council then refused to grant permission to this property developer to build apartments on the vacant land, which is now the garden and car park area. They refused to grant permission. And so the buyers' plan to demolish buildings and subdivide the land and construct apartments were all thwarted. So at this stage, ISKCON once again appeared, as I said, in plain clothes, and offered to purchase the property back off the developer. And the man accepted. So thus, eventually, 197 Dank Street, the International Society for Krishna Consciousness's first Australian headquarters, was purchased for an amount less than the original bidding price. This was 1974. Prabhupada was very, very happy to hear the news. This new property, he suggested, although substantially smaller than the huge convent, would also be more practical and easier to maintain. He told us a very, very nice story in this connection. A man, he said, once saw some beautiful big golden earrings in a store, and he became attracted to them, and he had a desire to purchase them. And his desire increased and increased. But the golden earrings were beyond his budget. So he took an extra job and worked long hours and finally got the money, and he purchased the golden earrings. Prabhupada continued with the story, but when he put them on, he said, he discovered that these earrings were so big and so heavy that they constantly gave him an earache and pulled on his ears. So in the end, he was forced to take them off. Prabhupada said that the moral of the story was that if one tries for something beyond his means, it would be a burden from beginning to end. Better, Prabhupada said, therefore, to get something manageable, even if smaller, and utilize the time thus saved in preaching. So that very nice story is related in my book. You may have read it. Madhavisa sent Prabhupada regular updates on the property, including descriptions and photographs. Prabhupada authorized that the deity should face east, and the installation of Krishna's Sudarshan chakra on the roof, that was approved by Srila Prabhupada. And Prabhupada was invited to come and inaugurate the temple. And this letter was sent to Prabhupada, and Prabhupada accepted the invitation. And the original plans were that he would come in January of 1975. But of course, we were not ready in January of 1975, so the plans were adjusted. They were adjusted twice, but the first adjustment was January is too early because there is so much work to do on the property. Renovation work on the new Melbourne property began at furious pace. Both buildings had been derelict. They needed extensive restoration. The ground floor was originally, we're talking about the ground floor of the other building, the temple building, not this building that you see here. That was originally classrooms. This was a boys' school. I'll tell you more about this later. And so this was the science rooms of the original boys' school. And that was going to be earmarked as the temple and deity room. And this building, of course, Prabhupada House, was very ornate. One large upstairs room which had originally been a chapel for the priests, was set aside as Prabhupada's personal quarters. The rest of the building was earmarked for offices, a kitchen, and a library. And soon we worked furiously to bring this building up to scratch. January 1975 deadline came and went. It couldn't be reached. And then this was right at the end of 1974. Madhavisa wrote to Prabhupada, "Can you come later after the Mayapur festival in 1975? Prabhupada had already planned his travel itinerary and he had told many devotees of his movements. But he was so adoring of his disciple, Madhavisa Swami, and so encouraging that he said yes. And he graciously adjusted his travel plans and arrive in Melbourne in May of 1975, of which this 50th anniversary is a celebration. However, the back-breaking months had passed and we were still not ready. The marble floor hadn't yet been poured, hadn't yet been laid in the temple. In fact, the concrete had not even been poured to place the marble on top of. And there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of smaller jobs. And Madhavisa calculated in discussion with his work crew, the devotees did everything except the marble, that they would fall short by 2 weeks. They would be 2 weeks short. So Madhavisa was pressed to make a decision. Should he again bother Srila Prabhupada to adjust his travel plans? He thought not. Instead, he considered an alternative. Prabhupada might prefer to visit somewhere else in Australia first. He was in Bombay at present, and he was due to arrive in Melbourne. Someone suggested Perth. They told Madhavisa that Perth would be geographically a good place for Prabhupada to stop. The weather was pleasant. There were no devotees in Perth. There was no ISKCON temple there, but it was directly on the way from India. And it wouldn't be difficult to rent a place there because there were some devotees in Melbourne at the time that originally came from Perth, Risha and Ganesh specifically. This would give the temple devotees in Melbourne enough time to finish the construction, and it would give Prabhupada an opportunity to so-called rest, although Prabhupada's resting was his preaching. It would give him 2 weeks to recuperate from his rigors of administration and traveling. Madhavisa contacted Prabhupada, and Prabhupada graciously agreed. And in early May of 1975, Prabhupada's plans were finalized. He would stay in Delhi for a few days. He would travel to Bombay for 1 day and then depart for Perth in Western Australia. They're having their 50th anniversary at the time of this recording. By the time you hear this, the Perth 50th anniversary celebrations would have ceased. And now, of course, we're in the throes of a wonderful celebration here in Melbourne. So Prabhupada was destined to visit Melbourne for the grand inauguration of the new headquarters for his thriving Australasian zone. And Prabhupada had agreed, and there was just time separating 2 weeks, in fact, for the whole Melbourne Temple to be refurbished before Srila Prabhupada's historical visit. And that visit, the continuation of that story, the opening, the actual inauguration of the temple will be presented to you in part 2 of this recording. So I thank you for listening, and I encourage you to read The Great Transcendental Adventure, get a copy, and immerse yourself in Srila Prabhupada's transcendental pastimes. I hope your festival is going wonderfully. I'm sure it is. And I hope that my little recording here has allowed you some access to the wonderful pastimes of Lord Chaitanya and Lord Nityananda, and of course, Srila Prabhupada. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. All glories to Srila Prabhupada.